The flashing blue lights painted the stone walls of Gloucestershire in eerie shades of sorrow. The night air was cold, still, almost too quiet for what had just happened. And yet, just beyond the hedgerow, on a narrow stretch of countryside road, lay the shattered remains of a royal convoy, the very one that had carried Princess and the heart of the British monarchy only minutes before. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The first whispers began online. A single tweet. A grainy image of a wrecked black Range Rover surrounded by emergency lights. Then came the headline that stopped Britain cold. Princess and involved in serious collision. Palace sources silent. What really happened that night? And more hauntingly, why is the palace saying so little? The world has seen its share of royal tragedies. But this felt different. This wasn't a distant memory from Diana's fatal crash in Paris. This was now, tonight, and it involved the one royal who had always been the symbol of unbreakable composure. Princess and the daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, the woman known for her discipline, her duty, her no-nonsense approach to life, suddenly the center of a devastating national emergency. She was supposed to be heading home from a charity event. Just a short drive. Routine. No fanfare, no motorcade of flashing lights, no grand security convoy. Just, and ever the minimalist royal. Doing what she's always done, quietly fulfilling her duty. But duty, it seems, can sometimes lead straight into danger. By the time paramedics arrived, the scene was chaos. Twisted metal, smoke rising into the damp night air. A royal bodyguard pinned against the steering column. And in the back seat, silence. No movement. No sound. It was then that one of the first responders reportedly whispered into his radio, his voice trembling. It's her. It's Princess Anne. The dispatcher paused. Confirm identification. Confirmed, he said. It's her. And at that very moment, the monarchy, already strained by controversies, fractured relationships, and a changing public perception, was plunged into crisis. The news spread like wildfire. Across social media, across television networks, across the globe. Royal family emergency. Princess Anne hospitalized. Buckingham Palace on lockdown. But amid the noise and confusion, one thing stood out. No one knew the full truth. Was this an accident? Or something much, much darker? The royal family's communications team went silent. Buckingham Palace issued only a single-line statement. Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal has been involved in a traffic incident. Medical attention is being provided. Further updates will follow. No photos. No footage. No reassurance. Nothing to calm a nation already fearing the worst. And that's where this story begins. Not with clarity, but with silence. Not with facts, but with fear. You see, Princess Anne was never one to seek attention. She shunned drama, avoided scandal, and carried herself with the quiet dignity her mother once called the backbone of the family. But tonight, her name filled every headline, and every whisper carried a question no one dared ask out loud. How could this happen to her? Let's go back just 12 hours before the crash. Anne was attending a low-profile event at a rural equestrian center near Cirencester. She smiled, shook hands, and gave her usual speech about the importance of discipline, compassion, and endurance, values she'd lived by her entire life. Those who saw her that afternoon said she looked radiant, healthy, strong. She laughed with the children, patted a horse's nose, and left the event with her trademark stoic smile. No one could have guessed that within hours, that same vehicle would be unrecognizable, crushed against a roadside barrier, its roof torn open by impact. It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder, do tragedies strike by chance, or are they sometimes the echo of something deeper, something unseen? Reports later suggested that her car had veered unexpectedly into the opposite lane before colliding head-on with a delivery van. The impact was brutal. Yet, there were no skid marks. No sign that brakes had been applied. That detail alone sent investigators spiraling down a maze of speculation. Mechanical failure? Driver fatigue? Or, as one insider later hinted, deliberate interference? But before we dive into those questions, we have to understand who Princess Anne really is, and why her life, her image, and her reputation make this tragedy so jarring to the public. Born in 1950, she was never the kind of royal who sought sympathy or applause. While her brothers made headlines for scandals and divorces, and built her legacy on hard work. She represented Britain in over 20,000 royal engagements. She served in multiple charitable causes, especially for Save the Children, and became one of the monarchy's most respected figures. Even Queen Elizabeth once said privately, "And is the only one I never worry about." So, when news of the crash broke, that was the line everyone remembered, and it suddenly felt cruelly ironic. The stoic daughter, the steady hand, the one person the Queen never worried about, now fighting for her life. The palace's hesitation to speak only deepened the tension. Reporters camped outside Gloucestershire Royal Hospital. Helicopters circled above. Security grew tighter. Yet, no one, not even senior press officers, could confirm Anne's condition. And in that vacuum of information, the whispers began to multiply. Some said she was stable. Others said she was in critical condition. A few even claimed she'd been airlifted to a private facility under an alias. But one rumor was more disturbing than the rest, that the crash may not have been random. A source close to Scotland Yard allegedly mentioned that irregularities were found at the scene, something about the car's control system being tampered with. Could that be true? Or was it another layer of media sensationalism feeding off a nation's fear? Either way, the mystery only grew. And through it all, the royal family remained silent, except for one voice. A voice trembling with emotion, recorded by a journalist outside Clarence House. It was Prince William, speaking briefly to reporters as he arrived to be with his father. "We're all praying," he said quietly. "My aunt is one of the strongest people I know. If anyone can fight through this, it's her." That single statement broke through the silence like a crack in the clouds, small, but deeply human. It reminded everyone that behind the titles, behind the centuries-old traditions, were people, frightened, grieving, uncertain. And yet, there was something else. Something almost chilling in the way the palace avoided answering key questions. Who was driving? Why was the princess traveling without her usual security escort? And why did nearby CCTV cameras, which should have captured the entire crash, suddenly malfunction minutes before impact? Coincidence? Perhaps. But history has taught us that when it comes to the royal family, coincidence is rarely simple. There's another detail that hasn't been widely discussed. Earlier that week, Princess Anne reportedly had a tense meeting with senior advisors at Buckingham Palace regarding internal changes to royal finances. She was known to be outspoken about certain cost-cutting measures that she felt undermined charitable commitments. Was there tension behind palace doors? Yes. But could that possibly connect to what happened next? It sounds impossible, until you start piecing together the small fragments that were almost brushed aside. Fragments like an unregistered car following Anne's convoy earlier that afternoon, or an anonymous phone call received by local police just before the crash, reporting a suspicious vehicle tailing a royal motor. It's details like these that transform an accident into a question mark. And while investigators scrambled to make sense of the wreckage, the British public held its breath. In pubs, homes, and offices, people whispered, "Not her. Please, not her." For many, and wasn't just a royal. She represented a certain kind of Britain, disciplined, modest, selfless. To lose her would feel like losing the last thread connecting the monarchy to the sense of duty the late Queen embodied. But then, just as dawn began to break over Gloucestershire, a single ambulance pulled away from the crash site under heavy escort. The curtains were drawn. The windows blacked out. Inside, paramedics fought desperately to stabilize her vitals. Minutes later, a convoy of unmarked vehicles left Buckingham Palace. King Charles had been woken at 2:47 a.m. He was described by one aide as ashen-faced but composed. The king immediately suspended all morning appointments and retreated to a private briefing room with senior security advisors. No one outside that circle knew what was said. But one detail did leak. Charles was overheard saying just 5 words. "Not Anne. Anyone but Anne." In that moment, it was clear this wasn't just a family emergency. This was personal. And as Britain waited for official word, one shocking detail about the crash scene began circulating among insiders. A detail that would send investigators down a darker, more dangerous path. Because when the wreckage was finally cleared from the road, mechanics found something they couldn't explain. A piece of metal lodged deep inside the vehicle's brake line. A piece that didn't belong to any part of the car. It was foreign. It was deliberate. And it changed everything. What really happened to Princess and on that lonely road? Was it mechanical failure, coincidence, or something far more sinister? One thing was certain. The palace could no longer contain the truth. And as the investigation began, the world would soon discover that this was not just an accident. It was the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in royal history. But what investigators found next would make the nation's heart stop all over again. What if the night you thought would end in quiet routine instead became the one that rewrote your entire legacy? That's the question investigators and millions of Britons have been asking since the moment Princess Anne's car veered off that narrow Gloucestershire road. The crash didn't just happen. It unfolded like a sequence of tiny, deliberate tragedies, one after another, each one timed just so. The road was clear, the weather dry. The vehicle, a Range Rover autobiography, barely a year old, equipped with the best security and driver assistance systems. Anne's driver, a veteran of royal protection with 2 decades of spotless service, was said to be alert, calm, and fully rested. And yet, within 60 seconds, everything collapsed into chaos. Eyewitnesses said it began with a strange flicker of the vehicle's rear lights. A brief dimming, then nothing. The car seemed to slow, and then, inexplicably, it accelerated. Fast. Too fast for that road. The first scream came from a cyclist half a mile away who saw the headlights swerve sharply across the lane. He said it was as if something invisible pulled the car sideways. Then came the sound, a sound that locals later described as not one, but 2 impacts. First metal against metal, then metal against stone, and then silence. For a few seconds, the countryside stood still. No movement. No sound except the faint crackle of fire beginning to spread beneath the crumpled bonnet. The first person to arrive was a farmer named Richard Bailey. He'd been tending to his sheep when he saw the flash of light through the trees. "I thought it was a lightning strike," he said later. "But then I heard someone shouting, and I ran." What he found at the scene would stay with him forever. The Range Rover's front was completely crushed against a stone wall. Smoke billowed out in gray clouds, mixing with the smell of gasoline. The driver's door was jammed shut. The back door, where Anne was seated, had shattered outward. Bailey said he recognized her instantly. "I froze," he admitted. "You grow up seeing her face in newspapers, on the telly, and there she was, covered in glass, not moving." He shouted for help, dialed emergency services, and tried to reach her, but the car's heat forced him back. Moments later, he heard sirens approaching from both directions. The first ambulance arrived just 3 minutes after the 999 call. A female paramedic named Emily Hughes took one look at the wreckage and whispered, "Please, not her." She'd served at royal events before. She knew what this meant. The next 30 minutes were a blur of adrenaline and dread. The driver was unconscious, bleeding heavily, but alive. And, however, showed no response. Her pulse was faint, her breathing shallow. Paramedics worked frantically under the flashing lights, their radios alive with chatter from higher authorities. Within minutes, the airspace above the crash site was cleared. A helicopter circled, not media, but royal security. Something bigger was already in motion. But here's where things began to get strange. When the fire was finally controlled and investigators arrived, they noticed something odd about the vehicle's underside. The metal didn't just look crushed, it looked punctured. Cleanly. Deliberately. Almost as if something had been inserted or detached. They logged it for evidence. A simple detail, they thought. Nothing more. But that small note would later become the cornerstone of a national investigation. Back at the scene, Emily Hughes rode in the ambulance with Anne, applying pressure to a wound on her shoulder. She later recalled that the princess's hand briefly twitched. A reflex, maybe, or something deeper. "I told her, 'You're all right, ma'am. Stay with us.' I thought," she squeezed back. That tiny moment of movement gave everyone hope. But the closer they got to Gloucestershire Royal Hospital, the more that hope began to fade. Her oxygen levels dropped. Her heart rate faltered. And then, without warning, her convoy of police escorts was ordered to change direction. A new destination. A private military hospital near Swindon, one rarely used, even by senior royals. The decision came from the very top, according to one officer. But why? That question has haunted the timeline ever since. Why move her away from the nearest trauma center, especially when every second mattered? Some say it was a matter of security. Others believe it was something else entirely. That perhaps, before doctors could even touch her, someone wanted to ensure total control over the narrative. Inside Buckingham Palace, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. Advisors rushed in from adjoining wings, faces pale. King Charles had reportedly been informed twice. First that, and was injured, then that her condition had deteriorated en route. He said nothing, just turned toward the window and whispered, "She always drove herself." Because that was the thing about, and she prided herself on independence. Even royal drivers joked that she often took the wheel herself on back roads. But that night, she wasn't driving. So why was her personal security detail behind the wheel, not her usual chauffeur? Why the sudden change in plans? According to palace staff, the official driver had been given unexpected leave that morning due to a family emergency. His replacement, Sergeant Philip Marsh, had been cleared and assigned within hours. But here's the unsettling part. Marsh himself later claimed he'd received a strange phone call instructing him to take the alternate route through the countryside rather than the highway. When asked who gave the order, he said he couldn't recall the name, only that the voice sounded official. A minor detail? Maybe. But details are where truth hides. By midnight, the road was sealed off to the public. Black SUVs lined the perimeter, their tinted windows glinting under the flashing lights. Forensics teams began photographing the wreckage under portable floodlights. Every inch was examined, every trace catalogued. One of them, a technician named Howard Mills, later told a colleague that the wreck didn't behave like a normal crash. The angles were wrong, the pattern of damage inconsistent with driver error. And then there was the odd smell, not just fuel, but something chemical, synthetic. Meanwhile, outside the Royal Hospital where and had been taken, reporters had gathered in silence. They didn't shout questions this time. They simply waited. The air was heavy, the crowd eerily quiet. One man whispered, "It feels like 1997 all over again." That comment spread across social media like wildfire. Because it was impossible not to think of Princess Diana. Another royal, another late-night crash, another cloud of unanswered questions. Except this time, the royal family was older, wiser, more guarded. They'd learned from history how to control chaos. But even the tightest grip can't hold back public suspicion forever. At exactly 3:12 a.m., a brief press alert from Buckingham Palace confirmed that the Princess Royal remains under observation. Nothing more. No reassurance, no description, no word of her condition. And yet, inside that hospital, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Senior physicians had been replaced within minutes by military doctors. Plainclothes officers stood at every door. Cell phones were confiscated. Even medical charts were locked away in secure cabinets. What were they protecting? Or more importantly, from whom? At 4:03 a.m., just as the first light touched the horizon, a nurse reportedly overheard one of the surgeons mutter, "This isn't just trauma. Look at this pattern." She wasn't talking about broken bones. She was talking about internal injuries, symmetrical bruising across Anne's ribcage that didn't match the seatbelt or the airbags. It was as if something struck her before the crash. Could it be from debris? From the steering mechanism? Or something even stranger? Investigators wouldn't say. The report would remain sealed. But one doctor, speaking anonymously weeks later, claimed there was a residue on her clothing that baffled toxicology experts. A metallic compound, not common to vehicle interiors. And it wasn't just found on Anne. It was also detected on the driver. That's when whispers began to shift from tragedy to possibility. Because if this wasn't an accident, then the implications were enormous. Who would want to harm Princess and the least controversial royal of them all? She had no enemies, no public feuds, no political ambitions. Unless, of course, she had recently stumbled upon something someone didn't want exposed. 2 weeks before the crash, and had quietly attended a private meeting at Balmoral with several members of the Royal Trust. It was meant to discuss land management, charity allocations, and environmental funds. Nothing unusual, except that a leaked memo showed she had questioned the unexplained reallocation of grant proceeds. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even newsworthy until now. Could that small act of scrutiny have made her a target? Or was this all just a web of coincidence and grief, tied together by fear and imagination? That's what makes this story so haunting. It could all be tragic chance. Or it could be the perfect cover-up. Either way, one fact remains unshakable. At 5:17 a.m., doctors managed to stabilize Princess Anne. Her heartbeat returned to steady rhythm. The official phrase used was critical but stable. What if the last time you saw someone alive, they smiled at you, and you never realized that smile was hiding a storm? Hours before the crash that shook Britain, Princess Anne stood beneath a clear sky at the Cotswold Equestrian Center. The autumn sun softened her features, and the crowd's modest applause carried the warmth of quiet admiration rather than frenzy. She had always preferred it that way, small events, genuine conversations, no drama. But that day, there was something different in her manner. Observers noticed. One described her as distracted but determined. Another said she seemed to be carrying something heavy behind her calm expression. And maybe she was. Because what no one in that crowd knew was that only 48 hours earlier, and had received a confidential briefing, one she reportedly described as deeply troubling. The details remained sealed, but according to one palace aide, it concerned irregularities in royal asset security. Some claimed it involved unauthorized data access to royal vehicles and communications. If true, it could explain everything that happened that night. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to that final event, the last time the public saw her. The air smelled faintly of hay and autumn leaves. A few local schoolchildren were waiting, nervously holding bouquets. The princess arrived precisely on time, stepping out of her dark green vehicle with that brisk, efficient motion she was known for. Her security officer, Sergeant Marsh, opened the door, scanning the crowd with trained eyes. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, and smiled, waved briefly, and made her way toward the podium. Her speech was meant to celebrate young equestrians and highlight the importance of discipline in sport. But her tone, as several attendees later described, carried an undertone of gravity. She spoke about unexpected challenges, resilience in the face of uncertainty, and the importance of integrity when the easy path tempts us. They sounded like general remarks at the time, but in hindsight, they feel almost prophetic. Halfway through her address, and paused unexpectedly. The pause was brief, just long enough for the audience to sense that something had interrupted her train of thought. She glanced toward the crowd, her eyes narrowing slightly at a man standing near the back. No one knows who he was. He wasn't part of her official entourage, nor listed among the invited guests. When event security reviewed footage later, that man was nowhere to be found in the registration logs. Coincidence? Maybe. But this is where patterns begin to form. After her speech, and spent nearly 40 minutes speaking with attendees. She laughed with a young rider, complimented another on her horse's grooming, and even cracked a small joke. "I'm rather envious of your stamina these days." It was classic and composed, witty, warm. But beneath that, one aide noticed her voice tremble once. Just once. When she returned to her vehicle, she lingered for a moment before getting in. She looked out over the fields, distant, thoughtful, as if replaying something in her mind. Sergeant Marsh reportedly asked, "Everything all right, ma'am?" Her reply, according to his recovered voice memo, was simple yet chilling in hindsight. "Philip, it's never all right. It's just manageable." Those 7 words would later be dissected by journalists, historians, and even psychologists trying to understand what she meant. Was it fatigue? A reflection on her life of duty? Or was it an acknowledgement that something beyond her control had already begun? The drive back from the equestrian center was uneventful. Traffic was light, the weather calm. She spoke briefly on her phone, possibly to her brother, King Charles, though palace records remain redacted. Witnesses say she laughed at least once during the call. Then she looked out the window, silent for the next 15 minutes. But there's another version of that timeline, one that never made headlines. According to internal GPS records later leaked by a journalist, Anne's car took a brief detour from the scheduled route. Instead of heading directly toward Buckingham Park, her residence, the car pulled into a private country road near a woodland area known locally as the Old Hollow. The stop lasted precisely 6 minutes. No explanation has ever been provided. Was it a technical check, a private phone call, or something more deliberate? A farmer nearby claimed he saw 2 figures outside the vehicle, one male, one female, standing beside the car, seemingly arguing. But his statement was dismissed by investigators as unreliable due to poor visibility. Still, His account lingers in reports, unsettlingly consistent with the 6-minute stop recorded by GPS. If that encounter did happen, what was said? What was exchanged? And why was that stop erased from official records released to the media? The truth may never be known, but it's in those missing minutes that the story begins to darken. And had always been cautious about security, especially since the infamous 1974 kidnapping attempt, when an armed man tried to abduct her on the Mall. Her calm defiance during that ordeal, replying, "Not bloody likely," to her attacker, became the stuff of royal legend. Since then, she trusted her instincts more than any protocol. So why did she ignore them that night? Was she following someone's request? Or was she trying to protect someone? Maybe even from within her own circle? By 9:30 p.m., she was seen leaving a small service road, returning to the main route. Traffic cameras captured her car passing through the last checkpoint before the crash, and appeared composed, her head turned slightly toward the passenger window. The driver's hands were steady on the wheel. Everything looked normal, and then nothing. The next footage, from a roadside CCTV camera less than half a mile ahead, cut off abruptly at 9:42 and 10 seconds p.m. When recording resumed 30 seconds later, all that could be seen were emergency lights flashing in the distance. Those 30 seconds, gone. Lost. Police technical teams later confirmed that the camera hadn't malfunctioned naturally. It had been manually overwritten. The timing matched perfectly with the black box data that showed the car's acceleration spike. Who could have accessed that system? It wasn't public infrastructure. The CCTV line was under local council jurisdiction, protected by encrypted remote access. Only authorized personnel could deactivate it. Someone had clearance. Someone who knew where she would be. The eerie part? That 6-minute stop earlier, right near the Old Hollow, was located less than 2 miles from the CCTV control tower. Coincidence? Or choreography? Meanwhile, in the hours after the crash, investigators reviewing Anne's phone discovered something unusual. Her last outgoing call, made just 12 minutes before impact, wasn't to family or staff. It was to a number not listed in any royal database, an encrypted line registered to a defunct charity office in London. What could she have been trying to say? Who was she reaching out to? When technicians decrypted fragments of that call, all they recovered was her voice, calm but firm. "I've seen enough. It's time," they knew. And then static. That's it. The final words ever recorded from Princess, and before her car collided with that stone wall. Those words changed the entire course of the investigation, because they hinted at intent, not despair, not confusion, but purpose. She was about to reveal something someone didn't want revealed. After that revelation, palace advisors were instructed to maintain discretion regarding Anne's recent activities. All personal correspondence from the week leading up to the crash was sealed. Her phone records were restricted to a small investigative circle under direct supervision of the Home Office. Even her staff were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, forbidding them from discussing her final schedule. But despite those efforts, a fragment of truth always finds its way to light. A letter. A single letter, handwritten and signed by Anne herself, was later discovered in her Buckingham Park study. It was addressed to her daughter, Zura. The letter was never meant for the public, but an unnamed palace insider leaked excerpts. It read, "You must always trust your instincts, even when others tell you to stay quiet. I have carried many burdens, but silence should not be one of them." Was that a mother's general advice, or a coded warning that she knew danger was coming? If she truly sensed it, why didn't she call off her journey? Why not ask for backup, or delay her return? Perhaps she believed she still had time. Or perhaps she thought that by confronting it herself, she could control the outcome. That's the tragedy of strength. Sometimes it convinces you you're untouchable. As the investigation into the crash deepened, analysts began retracing her final hours minute by minute. They cross-checked her itinerary, her meetings, her phone logs. And then, something curious appeared. One of her meetings that week, marked simply as confidential, private affairs, had been attended by a consultant with ties to a defense contractor specializing in vehicle tracking systems. That same contractor's name surfaced again in the maintenance logs for Anne's Range Rover. Was that just bureaucratic overlap, or a thread linking her meeting, her vehicle, and the override that caused her crash? Every theory only raised more questions. Every discovery only deepened the mystery. What's undeniable, though, is that her last day was marked by an unshakable duality. Calm on the outside, unease beneath the surface. Those who saw her described her as gentle but guarded. Those who worked with her said she seemed focused, as if preparing for something. Even the horse trainers at the equestrian center recalled that when she left, she turned back once, not toward the crowd, but toward the field itself, and whispered, "Always watch where the fences are." They thought she meant the riding course. But maybe, just maybe, she meant something else entirely. That final phrase, like so much about Anne's last day, feels more like a riddle than a farewell. A warning left in plain sight. And as the clock struck 9:42 that evening, every mystery, every hesitation, every unspoken word collided into a single, horrifying moment on a dark country road. But what investigators would find inside that wreck, and what they'd discover hidden in the car's encrypted data core, would shatter the illusion that this was just a royal tragedy. Because beneath the glass, the metal, and the silence lay evidence that someone had known exactly where she would be, down to the minute. And that realization would turn the entire palace into a house of suspicion. What if the real danger to the monarchy wasn't outside, but within? We're about to find out. It started with a phone that wouldn't stop ringing. Then another. Then another. By the time King Charles lifted his receiver, the entire east wing of Buckingham Palace was already awake. The corridors that usually hummed with quiet protocol now echoed with hurried footsteps and urgent whispers. Advisors in nightclothes. Guards half-dressed. Assistants pale as the moonlight streaking through the windows. Something terrible had happened. "Your Majesty, there's been an incident," said a trembling voice on the line. "It's Princess Anne. Her car." The sentence didn't finish. It didn't need to. Charles froze. His throat tightened. He looked across the dimly lit room at Camilla, who had already sat up in bed, watching his face shift from confusion to disbelief to raw fear. "Not Anne," he murmured, barely audible. "Not Anne." For a man who had spent his entire life behind the walls of duty, the emotion that broke through in that moment was unfiltered and devastating. Within minutes, his private secretary, Sir Clive Mindle, was at the door. Behind him trailed two members of the royal security team, their expressions grave. One handed Charles a secure phone, the kind reserved for emergencies that could shake governments, not families. "Confirmed collision on the A433 near Minchinhampton," the officer said. "Multiple vehicles. Possible fatality. Paramedics on scene. Princess Anne is being transported under escort." "Possible fatality?" Camilla interrupted sharply. "Who?" The officer hesitated. "Initial reports indicate one royal protection officer critically injured. Her Royal Highness is unresponsive but alive." The words, "but alive," landed like fragile glass. Charles sat down slowly. His hands trembled. "She's strong," he whispered, as if reminding himself. "She's always been strong." He rose abruptly. "Get William. Get him now." Across the palace, alarms of another kind began to ring, digital ones. Secure communications flashing red. Intelligence lines opening simultaneously between MI5, GCHQ, and Scotland Yard. A royal vehicle involved in a collision wasn't just a family matter. It was a matter of national security. And what they were about to uncover would throw the palace into total disarray. The king moved to his study. Papers still lay open on his desk from a meeting earlier that evening. Documents on climate initiatives, his handwriting neat and deliberate. Now, none of it mattered. The air felt heavy, claustrophobic. A knock on the door. It was Prince William, dressed hastily, his face pale but composed. He had the same expression his grandmother once wore during crises, that mixture of fear and duty. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. Charles nodded, eyes distant. "They say she's unconscious. They're taking her to Swindon." William frowned. "Swindon? Why not Gloucestershire Royal? It's closer." The question hung in the air like smoke. Charles didn't answer, because he didn't know either. Moments later, a young security officer entered, holding a tablet displaying the first internal reports. "There's something you need to see," he said. The screen showed aerial photos from police drones. The wreckage was horrific. Metal twisted like paper, debris scattered across the road. But it wasn't the destruction that froze the room. It was the pattern of impact. William leaned closer. "That's not a spin-out," he said, his military training kicking in. "That's a straight-line acceleration." No evasive maneuver, no braking. The officer nodded. Exactly. And sir, there's more. The car's system registered an override command. Charles turned sharply. Override. Yes, Your Majesty. External interference. Electronic. Meaning? Meaning, the officer said carefully. It might not have been an accident. The silence that followed was unbearable. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock above the mantelpiece, each second landing heavier than the last. Camilla whispered, "My God." Charles stood motionless, the weight of it all pressing down. So someone did this. The officer didn't answer. William exhaled hard, pacing. We need to lock this down. No leaks, no speculation. If this gets out, it's going to explode. But it was already too late. Across the world, the media storm had begun. Breaking, princess and involved in serious collision. The BBC interrupted its late-night program. Sky News went into rolling coverage. Within an hour, #PrayForAnne was trending globally. Back inside Buckingham Palace, staff were glued to screens as grainy photos of the crash scene began circulating online. Every shadow, every reflection, every unverified post added to the panic. Charles, usually methodical and deliberate, acted on instinct. Shut it down, he ordered. Every outlet, every account. Get our communications team on this now. Sir Clive hesitated. Your Majesty, we can't suppress all of it. There are witnesses, videos. Then control the narrative, Charles snapped. Make sure the truth doesn't get twisted before we even know what the truth is. But deep down, he knew it already had. William placed a hand on his father's shoulder. We should get to Swindon. Yes, Charles said. We leave immediately. Within 20 minutes, a private helicopter lifted off from the palace grounds under cover of darkness. No press statement. No confirmation. Just the sound of rotors slicing through the cold London air. As the city lights faded beneath them, Charles stared out the window, silent. His mind replayed every conversation he'd had with and over the past month. Her warnings about internal mismanagement, her frustration with new advisors, her insistence that something wasn't right within the palace structure. At the time, he'd brushed it off as typical and blunt, headstrong, unfiltered. But now, every word echoed with ominous clarity. William watched his father closely. You're thinking the same thing I am, aren't you? Charles didn't respond. He didn't have to, because both men knew the same truth. If this wasn't an accident, the threat wasn't just to Anne. It was to the entire institution. Back at Buckingham, Camilla remained behind, coordinating updates from security officials. She was shaken but controlled. For all her public criticism, she had grown close to, and in recent years, a bond built through shared endurance. When the next call came through, her hand trembled before answering. Your Majesty, said the voice of the head physician. She's alive, but barely. We're stabilizing her now. There's internal trauma, head injuries, and something unusual we're analyzing. What do you mean, unusual? There's a metallic residue, faint, but present, on her clothes and in the bloodstream. We've never seen anything like it. Camilla's face drained of color. Metallic residue? Are you suggesting poison? Not exactly. More like interference. A compound used in high-frequency devices. We're testing further. Camilla gripped the edge of her desk. Keep me informed. No one outside the family hears of this. When she hung up, her reflection in the glass looked like a stranger's. Pale, exhausted, frightened. For the first time, she realized that whatever had happened wasn't just tragic, it was calculated. By dawn, the king and William had reached the hospital. They were escorted through back corridors, away from the cameras. Nurses stepped aside. Doctors bowed their heads. And then they saw her. Princess and, pale, motionless, surrounded by machines. Her face was bruised, her hands cold. The hum of medical equipment filled the sterile air. Charles stood beside her bed, tears welling in his eyes. He reached out, gently brushing her hand. Annie, he whispered, using the childhood nickname only family ever used. Please stay with me. William stood back, jaw clenched. He hated seeing his father like that, vulnerable, broken. But he hated something else even more, the quiet thought forming in his mind. What if this wasn't random? What if someone had planned this? And worse, what if they were inside the same walls they called home? Hours later, a briefing was held in a secure room of the hospital. Present were the king, Prince William, the Home Secretary, and the head of MI5. The MI5 director began with calm precision. We've reviewed the telemetry data from the vehicle. The override command was executed using a secure signal. That type of signal requires military-level encryption. William leaned forward. So, an insider? Possibly. Someone with access to the Crown's technical systems, or those who service them. Charles stared blankly at the wall. Do you have names? The director hesitated. We have a short list. Contractors, advisors, possibly one member of the royal security team. The king's jaw tightened. Then you will find them. Yes, Your Majesty. But there's another issue. The same type of interference was detected briefly on the palace's internal network earlier this week. It lasted only seconds, almost undetectable, but it originated from inside London. Inside London? William repeated. Where? The director looked up slowly. Buckingham Palace. The room went silent. Charles leaned back in his chair, the color draining from his face. You're saying whoever did this might be one of us. We can't rule it out, the director replied softly. William slammed his hand on the table. Then find them before they find someone else. Outside that room, aides whispered about the growing unease spreading through the palace staff. Security checks were being repeated, background verifications rerun, digital access restricted. The monarchy had gone into quiet lockdown. But rumors, like smoke, always find cracks. By mid-morning, news outlets had begun speculating that the royal family was withholding critical information. Conspiracy forums exploded with theories, everything from sabotage to political revenge. The world was already spinning, and the palace could no longer stop it. Inside her hospital room, Anne's condition remained critical but stable. She hadn't regained consciousness, but doctors noted subtle signs of brain activity improving. A flicker of fingers, a twitch of the eyelid. Charles refused to leave her side. At one point, William placed a hand on his father's shoulder. We'll find out who did this, he said quietly. Charles nodded, but his eyes, weary, haunted, revealed another truth. He wasn't just seeking justice. He was seeking forgiveness for not believing her warnings sooner. Because deep down, he knew and had seen this coming. And when she finally opened her eyes, she might reveal a secret that could either protect the crown or destroy it. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. And the closer investigators looked into the people surrounding her, the ones she trusted most, the clearer it became that someone inside that sacred circle had betrayed her. Someone very close. And when that name finally surfaced, it would send shockwaves through the monarchy itself. They say the first to arrive at a tragedy are the ones who never forget. But what if what they saw, or what they were told to forget, was never meant to reach the light of day? The men and women who responded to Princess Anne's crash that night were trained for chaos. They'd seen twisted wrecks, fatal burns, and the kind of horror that stays with you. But none of them were prepared for what they found on that narrow Gloucestershire road. The call came in at 9:43 p.m., multiple vehicle collision on the A433, possible entrapment. Standard enough. But when the dispatcher added a quiet, almost trembling line, it's a royal vehicle, every voice on the radio changed. Static filled the silence, followed by a flurry of codes and sirens erupting into the night. Paramedic Emily Hughes was one of the first on the scene. She was 28, barely 5 years into the service, and had responded to her share of motorway accidents. But that night, something felt wrong the moment her ambulance rounded the bend. There was no sound, she later said. Usually you hear screaming, movement, something. But there was just the wind and the crackle of fire. The headlights cut through the smoke. The Range Rover was on its side, pinned against a low stone wall. The engine still hissed, fluids pooling beneath it. Emily stepped out, her boots crunching on glass, and immediately saw the royal insignia on the number plate. Her heart stopped. Control, confirm. Is this the Princess Royal's vehicle? There was a pause. Then, quietly, confirmed. That word, confirmed, changed everything. Standard procedure dissolved. A security cordon was activated within minutes. Local police were rerouted by armed protection units. Every paramedic on site was now working not just under emergency response, but under classified protocol. Emily and her partner forced open the rear door. The air was thick with the smell of oil and something acrid, metallic, chemical, unnatural. It didn't smell like just fuel, she said later. It burned your nose. Inside, and was slumped sideways, seatbelt half torn, shards of safety glass across her coat. Her breathing was shallow, but she was alive. Emily pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Weak pulse. We've got a live one. Her partner called for backup while Emily assessed the injuries. Bruising on the shoulder. Deep laceration near the temple. But something else caught her attention. A faint glimmer on Anne's collar. She leaned closer. It was a fine dust, silver gray, glittering under the flashlight. I brushed it with my glove, Emily recalled. It wasn't soot. It clung to the fabric, like powder. She made a mental note. But when the security team arrived minutes later, they ordered her to stop touching the princess's clothing. Step back, said the commanding officer, a tall man with an earpiece and no visible insignia. We'll handle the transfer. Emily froze. Sir, she's critical. We need to stabilize her before. Step back. The man's tone left no room for argument. She obeyed, but not before she saw him slip something, a small vial, from his pocket and swabbed the glittering residue off Anne's coat. He sealed it, pocketed it, and walked away. Who was he? No one knew. His name never appeared in any official responder log. His vehicle, an unmarked black SUV, wasn't listed among the authorized response units. When Emily asked about him later, her supervisor told her, "You must have been mistaken. No such officer was on site." But she wasn't mistaken. She remembered his eyes, cold, calculating, almost rehearsed. And she remembered his voice when he leaned toward another security officer and muttered, "Get the sample to the lab in London." No record, no transfer forms. What were they hiding? While the paramedics focused on saving and a secondary team attended to the driver, Sergeant Marsh. He was pinned under the steering column, barely conscious. When firefighters finally freed him, he tried to speak. His words were slurred, incoherent, but one phrase was recorded clearly on a responder's body cam. "They told me, don't take the road." Then he lost consciousness. That footage never made it into the official report. It was classified, sensitive, and later deleted from local police servers. But a backup remained, copied unknowingly to the body cam's manufacturer cloud. Months later, it was leaked anonymously to a journalist. And that's how the world learned the first truth. Sergeant Marsh had been warned not to take that road. But by whom? Meanwhile, back at the crash site, the cleanup had already begun, faster than any standard procedure should allow. Within 20 minutes, royal security vehicles lined the road. A portable floodlight illuminated the scene, and black-clad technicians began collecting debris, piece by piece. Emily noticed one of them lifting something heavy from beneath the car, a chunk of metal that didn't match any part of the Range Rover's design. It was long, narrow, and coated in the same silvery dust she'd seen on Anne's clothing. The technician whispered into his radio, "Artifact recovered." When she later tried to include the detail in her written report, her supervisor crossed it out. "Remove this," he said. "It's classified." That was the moment Emily realized she wasn't just treating a royal patient. She had stumbled into something far larger, something dangerous. The rest of the night unfolded in fragments. A convoy arrived to escort the ambulance. The airspace above was restricted. Civilian responders were asked to hand over their notes, phones, and body cams. "You're under non-disclosure," one officer warned. "Anything you saw or heard tonight stays here. Violate that, and you'll face legal consequences." Most complied, but not all. A firefighter named Daniel Crow, who helped cut open the vehicle's roof, quietly slipped one item into his jacket. A small, scorched fragment of circuit board found beneath the dashboard. It looked out of place, half melted, with markings he didn't recognize. He didn't know why he kept it. Maybe instinct. Maybe fear. But weeks later, when investigators traced the crash's cause to an electronic override, Crow's fragment suddenly mattered. He sent it anonymously to an independent analyst, and what they found changed everything. The circuit board contained microchips registered to a private defense contractor, one that had recently secured a quiet contract with the royal household for vehicle safety integration. The same contractor and had reportedly questioned weeks earlier during her private meeting at Balmoral. Coincidence? Or consequence? And then came the part no one outside the responder circle was supposed to know. When Anne was loaded into the ambulance, the paramedics were ordered not to communicate via radio. The directive came from a royal liaison officer who entered mid-transfer. "Radio silence," he commanded. "All communication through secure channel only." But halfway to Gloucestershire Royal Hospital, the secure channel flickered, replaced by static and a voice none of them recognized. Redirect to Facility Bravo. Repeat, redirect to Facility Bravo. Do not announce destination. The driver hesitated. Say again. Facility Bravo. Authorization code 7 Delta. That was all. Emily looked at her partner, confused. What's Facility Bravo? He didn't know. But the escort vehicles suddenly changed formation, turning left off the main road. The hospital ahead faded from view as the convoy veered toward Swindon. That single detour would later raise endless questions, questions still unanswered to this day. By the time they arrived at the secretive military hospital, Anne's vitals were fading fast, her pulse weak, her breathing shallow. But just before they transferred her inside, something happened that chilled Emily to her core. Anne's eyes flickered open, just for a moment. Her lips moved, struggling to form a word. Emily leaned close, holding her hand. What is it, ma'am? Stay with me. Anne's voice was faint, barely a whisper. It wasn't the road. Then her eyes closed again. It wasn't the road. That sentence haunted Emily for months. It suggested intent, awareness. That and somehow knew the cause wasn't where she'd been, but something or someone else. When Emily tried to document it in her official report, her supervisor intercepted the file. Omit that, he said flatly. It's inadmissible. She was incoherent. But Emily remembered it word for word. And when she tried to speak to the press weeks later, her home phone rang in the middle of the night. A male voice, calm, emotionless, said, Ms. Hughes, for your own safety, stop talking. Then silence. After that, she never spoke publicly again. She left the paramedic service 6 months later and disappeared from public life. Her address remains unlisted. But fragments of her story lived on, shared quietly between journalists, investigators, and those who refused to let the truth be buried. And those fragments pointed to one unsettling reality. The crash site had been cleaned, the responders silenced, and the evidence erased almost in real time. Who had the power to do that? The military? The palace? Someone inside intelligence? Whoever it was, they'd moved faster than any ordinary cover-up. And just when it seemed the story had been contained, a single forgotten witness came forward, a roadside worker named Alan Porter, who had been checking maintenance signs half a mile from the crash. He swore under oath that moments before the collision, he saw 2 vehicles on that road, not one. The second was a dark SUV, lights off, following closely behind Anne's car. When investigators checked traffic camera data, that SUV was missing, scrubbed clean from the footage. Every second of video between 9:41 and 9:43 p.m. had been deleted. But Porter's testimony couldn't be ignored. He even described something stranger. As he turned to look at the crash, he saw a faint blue flicker, not from the car's headlights, but from the tree line above, like an electrical discharge. Moments later, the Range Rover accelerated uncontrollably. That flicker, that surge, that missing SUV. All pieces of a puzzle that now pointed to deliberate interference, high-tech, targeted, and terrifyingly precise. And if the responders' stories were true, it meant one undeniable thing. Someone knew exactly when Princess Anne would be on that road, and they were waiting for her. But who leaked her route? Who authorized the command? And why did a royal security officer, the man sworn to protect her, receive that mysterious phone call hours before the crash, warning him not to take the road he was ordered to? The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became. The sabotage wasn't just about silencing Anne. It was about silencing what she had discovered. And the next chapter of this story would reveal exactly what that was, and why her survival threatened to expose a secret capable of shaking the monarchy to its core. What do you do when the evidence that's supposed to reveal the truth keeps disappearing? When every question you ask gets answered with another locked door? That was the grim reality investigators faced as the official inquiry into Princess Anne's crash began. The nation had barely woken up when Scotland Yard held its first closed-door meeting. It was 7:15 a.m. in London. Overcast skies, drizzle against the windows, the kind of weather that always seemed to accompany bad news. The faces around the table were pale, drawn, and tired. The commissioner himself looked older than his years as he adjusted his glasses and said the words everyone dreaded. We have reason to believe this was not an accident. Silence. At that same moment, Millions across Britain were watching morning news anchors stumble through updates that said everything and nothing. Sources close to Buckingham Palace confirm that Princess Anne remains in critical condition. There are unverified reports of irregularities at the crash scene. The royal family has yet to make a public statement. Behind the cameras, however, the story was already unraveling in directions no one could control. The first major problem? The data. When investigators retrieved the black box from Anne's Range Rover, they discovered something impossible. The internal drive had been partially wiped. Not completely destroyed, but corrupted, as if someone had selectively removed key moments. Between 9 hours, 41 minutes, and 12 seconds, and 9:42:17, a critical window of exactly 65 seconds, all telemetry data was missing. Not a glitch, not damage from impact. Deliberate erasure. The digital forensics team confirmed it within hours. This was done remotely, one analyst said. Someone accessed the vehicle's system wirelessly and issued a command to overwrite the log. How's that possible? Asked the lead investigator. Only if the override was pre-installed. Those 5 words changed the entire tone of the investigation. If the car's system had been tampered with before the crash, it meant someone had planned this well in advance. It also meant whoever did it had access to royal security infrastructure, because the Range Rover wasn't just a luxury vehicle. It was part of the royal motor fleet, equipped with custom security features linked directly to classified databases. To hack that wasn't the work of an amateur. It was inside knowledge. As one investigator put it bluntly, this wasn't some lunatic on the road. This was someone with clearance. But that wasn't the only anomaly. When they inspected the mechanical remains, they found that the brake line, already flagged in earlier reports, showed signs of precision puncture. A hole clean enough to suggest industrial tools, not accident debris. And embedded in the metal? The same silvery residue that had been found on Anne's clothing and the mysterious circuit fragment recovered by firefighter Daniel Crowe. The lab analysis was supposed to take a week. It took 3 hours before the samples were seized by an unnamed government division. For further testing, they said. But when the lab technician asked for documentation, none was provided. The samples, along with the residue report, vanished into the bureaucratic ether. And that's when investigators realized something chilling. Someone wasn't just trying to hide evidence. They were watching the investigation in real time. Every time a report was filed, an external encryption ping traced back to London, somewhere within the government network itself. Whoever had orchestrated the crash wasn't gone. They were still here, following every move, every discovery, erasing every thread that got too close to the truth. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere had shifted from panic to paranoia. Staff whispered in corridors, avoiding eye contact. Doors that were once open were now locked. William called for a full review of palace personnel access logs, and that's when they found it. A routine maintenance order, filed 3 days before the crash, requesting a software update for Anne's Range Rover. The form was signed off by a name none of them recognized, J. Keating. There was just one problem. No such person worked for the palace, nor for any of its contracted security divisions. The signature was forged, the authorization code authentic. Whoever had done this had inside access to real credentials, and it got worse. When investigators traced the source of that authorization, it led them straight to a private data security firm, one that, on paper, specialized in communications testing and defense-grade software integration. The company's name? Arcturus Systems, Ltd., registered in London, owned through shell companies stretching across Cyprus and the Isle of Man. But dig a little deeper, and a different picture emerged. Arcturus wasn't just a tech firm. It was a quiet subcontractor for multiple defense contracts, including military vehicles, intelligence communication gear, and most importantly, the Royal Fleet Monitoring System. It was the same company and had questioned at Balmoral 2 weeks before her crash. Now it was everywhere, in her vehicle data, her maintenance logs, and her final phone call before the collision. Coincidence was no longer an option. A second investigative task force was formed, led by Detective Chief Inspector Lena Harrow, sharp, methodical, and unflinchingly direct. Her first act was to interview everyone who had interacted with and in the days leading up to the incident. Staff, advisors, drivers, security officers. One by one, their stories lined up until they reached one man, Captain Andrew Sellers, a former logistics officer now responsible for scheduling royal travel routes. His account was solid, professional, until